The rain had not ceased for 3 nights. The Seine was swollen and grey, pushing against its stone banks like a restless prisoner. Beneath the faint light of the Pont de Charenton, a body lay caught between the weeds, the pale outline of a man whose face the current had half erased. When Inspector Moreau arrived, his coat heavy with the damp, he did not look first at the corpse. He looked at the bridge. There was something in its silence that reminded him of old crimes, those that never made the papers, those that left no names. In the flicker of the gaslight, he thought of how many stories began the same way, with the river keeping its own counsel. As the fog thickened, a single thought passed through his mind, not about the victim nor the killer, but about Paris itself, the city that offered clues like whispers, then swallowed them whole. He struck a match, lit his pipe, and muttered to Lucas, "No witnesses, no footprints, just the river talking to itself." Somewhere in that murmur the case began, quiet, unassuming, and destined to change everything that followed. If you've been drawn into mysteries where every glance hides a secret and every silence feels louder than words, then you'll find a home here. Stay with us through this case, like, share, and subscribe, and let the fog lift one layer at a time. Because in Moreau's Paris, truth never comes easily. It must be earned, clue by clue. The dawn came reluctantly, dragging its grey fingers through the fog that still clung to the Seine. Paris seemed to breathe slower in the wet air, as though the entire city was holding its breath. Inspector Moreau stood near the stone balustrade, his collar turned up against the drizzle, watching 2 uniformed men haul the body from the river. It was a man, middle-aged, thin, his hair slicked flat by the water. The body swayed like a broken marionette as they laid it on the embankment stones, and for a moment no one spoke. Only the soft hiss of the rain filled the silence. Moreau bent down, his knees creaking, and examined the face. The eyes were half open, the skin waxen, the mouth slightly twisted as if the river had whispered one last secret into it. A faded bruise marked the left temple, and a small cut ran along the jawline, not fatal, but telling. There was no wallet, no watch, nothing to name him. Just a man removed from life, dressed in an old wool coat and a pair of muddy boots, as if he had walked himself into the river. But Moreau knew better. Paris was full of ghosts who wanted to disappear. This one had help. Lucas, his trusted sergeant, stood nearby with his notebook. "Fishermen found him at first light," he said quietly. "No witnesses. No one claims to have seen anything. The tide carried him from upstream, perhaps?" "Perhaps," Moreau replied, still studying the coat. The fabric was of good quality, provincial cut, and a faint scent of machine oil lingered on it. He glanced at the hands, workers' hands, calloused but clean beneath the grime. A man who knew tools, but not poverty. The bridge loomed above them, its arches heavy with moss and memory. Moreau's pipe smoke rose in slow circles, merging with the mist. "He wasn't thrown here," he said at last. "He was placed. Someone wanted him found, but not too quickly." Lucas frowned. "Why here, then? The river's full of quieter places." Moreau's gaze drifted along the embankment where the lamplight still flickered weakly. "Because here," he murmured, "the water speaks just loudly enough to cover what was done." He turned, gesturing toward the narrow street that curved up from the river. "Go to the cafe at the corner. Ask who saw what during the night. Someone always sees. They just don't know they've seen it yet." While Lucas trudged off, Moreau remained, lost in thought. He had seen hundreds of bodies in his years at the Quai des Orfèvres, but this one carried a certain quiet defiance, not the desperation of suicide, nor the rage of murder born in passion. It felt deliberate, a piece of theatre whose meaning he had yet to understand. He brushed a thumb over the lapel and found a small tear near the seam. Inside, a scrap of paper clung to the lining, soaked but legible. R & Co. Rouen. A tailor's mark, perhaps, or a clue wrapped in coincidence. He pocketed it carefully and rose just as Lucas returned. The young man shook his head. "No one saw a thing, sir, but the old woman upstairs and the one who keeps the flower stall says she heard a carriage pass around midnight, too heavy for milk or bread, and too early for the morning market." "Carriage, not motor?" Moreau asked. "She insists, the sound of hooves." That narrowed it. Few used horses now except traders from the provinces or those who wanted to move unseen. Moreau nodded, his thoughts knitting quietly. "Tell them to bring the body to the morgue. I'll join you after I've seen the bridge from above." As Lucas led the men away, Moreau crossed to the centre of the Pont de Charenton. The river flowed sluggishly below, reflecting the dim light like a moving mirror. Across the water, the city was still asleep. Windows dark, chimneys silent, a few barges rocking lazily near the docks. The inspector's gloved hand brushed the stone railing. There were scratches near the edge, recent, uneven, as if something heavy had scraped across it. Perhaps the body had been lowered by rope. He imagined two figures working silently under the fog, the splash swallowed by the night. He pulled out his pocket watch, 6:30. A few minutes more, and the bakeries would light their ovens, the streets would stir, and Paris would resume its indifferent rhythm. Yet here, under this bridge, a man had died quietly, while the world slept. Moreau turned and made his way toward the narrow lane behind the embankment. The cobblestones glistened under the rain, the walls damp with the smell of rot and soot. A cat darted across his path, startled by the echo of his boots. In one doorway he paused, an open window above, faint movement behind a curtain. He stared for a long second before calling softly, "Madame, you were awake last night." A pause. Then the curtain shifted, and a woman's face appeared, pale, lined, with eyes like smoked glass. "I don't speak to police," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't ask you to," Moreau replied gently. "But the river might have." Something in his tone disarmed her. The window opened wider. "I heard wheels," she said after a moment. "Wooden, slow, then a thud. I thought it was the market cart. But when I looked out there was only fog, and a light, a lantern swinging near the bridge." "Whose lantern?" "I don't know. I thought perhaps someone searching for a dog. I didn't look long." Moreau nodded, tipping his hat. "If you remember anything else, even a sound, send word to the Quai des Orfèvres." When she withdrew, the inspector lingered. A lantern at midnight, that small detail burned in his mind. Whoever carried it had been confident enough to work in plain sight, trusting the fog and indifference of the city to hide them. By the time he reached the morgue, the body had been cleaned and laid out beneath the harsh white lights. The medical officer, a round man with weary eyes, looked up from his report. "No water in the lungs," he said immediately. He was dead before he hit the river, blow to the head, clean, controlled. A man who knew what he was doing. "Anything on him?" Moreau asked. "Nothing. Not even a name tag, but see here, ink on the fingers, left hand only. Could be from writing or handling papers." Moreau stepped closer. The ink stains were faint, bluish, but distinct. He thought again of the tailor's mark, the scent of machine oil, the well-made coat. A clerk, perhaps, or an accountant. Someone whose work dealt in numbers and signatures. "Rouen," he murmured, half to himself. The officer raised an eyebrow. "You think he's from there?" "I think something from there followed him here," Moreau said softly. Outside, the city had awakened. Carriages rattled along the streets, vendors called from corners, and the morning papers shouted their usual small scandals. But for Moreau, the world had narrowed to a single thread. A dead man from Rouen, a lantern in the fog, and the bridge that had chosen to keep its secrets just long enough. As he walked back toward headquarters, the inspector's thoughts wandered to the river once more. The Seine, he mused, had a strange sense of justice. It brought everything to light. Eventually. but only after washing away what was no longer needed. He would send a telegram before noon to Rouen prefecture. A quiet request for missing persons, male, 40 to 50, employed in trade or industry. Somewhere in that city, someone was missing a man who had left without a word. And somewhere between Rouen and Paris, a truth waited, damp and stubborn, like the fog that refused to lift. At the top of the stairs leading from the embankment, Moreau paused and looked back once more at the bridge. A single gull wheeled overhead, its cry sharp and lonely against the morning air. He drew deeply on his pipe, exhaled, and whispered, "We'll see where you take me, old friend." Then he turned toward the Quai des Orfèvres, his silhouette dissolving into the pale, rain-soaked light of Paris. The rain had eased by afternoon, leaving behind a fine mist that hung low over the rooftops. Inspector Moreau sat at his desk in the Quai des Orfèvres, the light from the window dull and uncertain. The report from Rouen had not yet arrived. He had been expecting a telegram by noon, but the lines were slow that day. Storms over the countryside had delayed half of northern France. He didn't mind the wait. Patience to him was not a virtue, but a tool, like a scalpel. It was what separated those who hunted truth from those who merely stumbled upon it. He stirred his coffee absently, the surface trembling slightly in rhythm with the passing trams outside. The scent of damp paper filled the room, and the faint echo of typewriters clattered from the hall. The city had begun to move again, indifferent as ever to its own crimes. He leaned back, eyes half closed, and thought of the woman in the window, the one who had seen the lantern near the bridge. Her face had stayed with him, not for beauty or sorrow, but for something far rarer. The look of someone who feared remembering. He rose abruptly, took his coat, and told Lucas, "We'll visit her again, but this time we'll ask what she didn't say." The building stood at the edge of the river, 3 floors of flaking plaster and crooked shutters. Inside, the stairwell smelled of boiled cabbage and tobacco. A child's laughter echoed from above, followed by the slam of a door. When they knocked, the same voice as before answered, hesitant, then resigned. "I told you everything," she said, not yet opening the door. "Then perhaps you forgot something," Moreau replied. "Memory is a tricky ally." After a pause, the lock clicked. She appeared again, wrapped in a shawl, her grey hair pinned back hastily. The flat was small, cluttered, filled with the smell of drying flowers. Stems of lilac hung from a cord near the window, their colour already fading. "You sell flowers at the corner?" Moreau asked softly. "I did," she said, "until last winter. My hands don't keep steady anymore." He nodded, his eyes wandering over the room. A single photograph stood on the table, a young man in a railway uniform, his face bright and certain. "Your son?" Her gaze lowered. "He died near Meaux in the floods, 5 years now." "I'm sorry," Moreau said quietly. "And since then you've lived alone?" "Yes. The building keeps its noises. I have mine." He stepped closer to the window, looking out toward the bridge. "You said you saw a lantern last night. Where exactly?" She joined him reluctantly, pointing toward the dark curve of the arch. "There, near the 3rd pillar. It moved like someone searching, then stopped. I thought maybe a fisherman." "Did you see anyone else? A second figure, perhaps?" Her silence lasted too long. Then she sighed. "There was a man earlier, around dusk, standing under the lamppost. He didn't move, just watched the river. I remember because he smoked without a match, as if the flame came from inside the pipe." "Describe him." "Tall, coat too large, hat low over his face. I noticed a limp when he walked away, but I didn't see where he went." Lucas noted it quickly, his pencils scratching like rain on glass. Moreau watched the woman's trembling hands, the way she avoided his eyes. "You've lived here long," he said. "Do you know the people who come and go by the bridge?" "Not any more," she whispered. "The city changes faster than its streets. Faces vanish, voices move on. He thanked her and turned to leave, but at the door she stopped him. "Inspector." "Yes?" "Do you think the river remembers?" He studied her for a moment, the question lingering between them like the scent of wet lilac. "Only what it can't forget," he said. Then he left her standing by the window, staring into the fog. Outside, Lucas walked beside him in silence until they reached the corner. "A man with a limp," he muttered. "Could be anyone." "Could be," Moreau said. "But a limp leaves more than a trail. It leaves rhythm. People recognize rhythm even when they forget faces." They turned toward the cafe at the corner, the Café Montrose, the kind of place that never closed entirely, that lived between mornings and nights. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and steam, the clatter of cups blending with low conversation. The barman, polishing a glass with slow indifference, looked up as they entered. "Coffee," Moreau said, placing his hat on the counter. "And information." The man smiled faintly. "The first I can serve. The second depends on the price." "Consider the price already paid," Moreau replied. "Did anyone here mention the bridge last night? A commotion? A sound? A carriage, perhaps?" The barman shrugged. "It rained. Nobody goes walking for pleasure when it rains, except maybe the mad or the guilty." Moreau's eyes narrowed. "And which are you?" "I serve both," the man said simply, and turned away to fill the cup. Lucas shifted uneasily, but Moreau seemed amused. He took the coffee, inhaled the bitter steam, and asked, "Do you know anyone who walks with a limp?" The barman's hand paused mid-motion. "Perhaps. Many do. Paris limps in its own way." "Try to remember one near this bridge," Moreau pressed. "Tall, hat low, smokes without light." For a moment, the only sound was the rain against the windows. Then the man leaned in, lowering his voice. "There's a fellow comes sometimes, calls himself Durand, works nights at the river depot, sorting freight. He's not fond of questions, but he spends money like he's washing it off his hands." Moreau finished his coffee and left coins on the counter. "Merci. If he returns, tell him the river is asking for him." As they stepped out, the clouds had begun to gather again, rolling over the rooftops like slow grey beasts. The lamps along the quay flickered alive one by one. Paris at dusk always reminded Moreau of unfinished cases. Dim, uncertain, waiting for their final sentence. They walked toward the depot, the smell of oil and rope thick in the air. Barges shifted along the docks, their chains groaning softly. In the distance, a church bell marked 7. A few workers lingered near the warehouse doors, their laughter hollow, their hands black with coal dust. "Durand," Moreau said, showing the badge. "Where is he?" One of the men jerked a thumb toward the far shed. "Inside, sorting manifests." The inspector crossed the slick planks, his boots echoing. Inside, the air was heavy with damp paper and tar. Durand stood by a table under a weak lamp, a ledger open before him. The limp was unmistakable, slight, but present, each step uneven as if he dragged part of the past behind him. "Good evening," Moreau said. Durand looked up slowly, his eyes narrow and alert. "If it's about customs, you're too late. The office closes at 6. "It's about the river," Moreau replied. "You were seen near the bridge last night." "Seen by whom?" "The river," Moreau said. "And a woman who no longer sells flowers." Durand smiled faintly. "Then the river lies. I was here all night, with witnesses. Ask them." Moreau stepped closer, studying his hands. They were stained, not with ink, but with oil. "You handle machinery." "Barges, ropes, crates, same as everyone else." "But you smoke," Moreau said. "And your pipe?" Durand hesitated, then reached into his pocket. The pipe was old, wooden, chipped at the rim, but dry. Too dry for a night of rain. "You cleaned it this morning?" Moreau asked. "I don't see how that concerns you." "It concerns the man pulled from the Seine." Durand's smile faded. "Plenty of men drown there. You'll wear yourself thin chasing ghosts." Moreau met his gaze calmly. Ghosts don't limp. The silence that followed was heavy. The sound of the river seeped through the walls, slow and constant. Durand looked away first, closing the ledger with a thud. "If you have more questions, bring a warrant. Otherwise, let me work." Moreau nodded slightly. "I will. But when you see the water again, remember, it doesn't keep secrets long." As they left, Lucas muttered, "He's hiding something."
"They all are," Moreau said. "The trick is to know which lie is worth believing." Behind them, the lamps flickered and the fog began to rise again, curling around the bridge like a waiting thought. The wire from Rouen arrived after nightfall, its blue slip damp where the clerk's thumb had pressed it too hard. Lucas brought it in without a word, and Inspector Moreau read it, standing beside the file cabinet, the lamplight throwing a tired halo over the paper. Male, 48, missing since Tuesday. Name, Etienne Lemaire. Occupation, accountant at Pellerin and Renault, Machine Works, Docks, quarter of Rouen. Last seen at the station, ticket to Paris. Not arrived. Description, medium height, thinning hair, a narrow scar along the jaw from a childhood fall. The words were spare, civic, yet beneath them Moreau felt the faint shiver that comes when a name begins to knit itself to a corpse. He looked again at the lines about industry, numbers, docks, the scent of machine oil, the ink on the left fingers, the careful coat. Pellerin and Renault. R&Co, a tailor's mark or a shorthand habit of the mind. He did not know yet which, only that the river had not been generous by accident. He pushed the window open and let the night air into the office. Somewhere down on the quay, a whistle blew, not urgent, just a note that reminded the city it was still working. "Janvier," he called, and the younger man stepped in, hat in hand, eyes still bright with the restlessness of an evening unspent. Moreau handed him the telegram. "I'll take the morning train to Rouen. You'll shadow Durand tonight and tomorrow. No noise, no heroics. If he turns toward the bridge again, you are the shadow that arrives first." Janvier nodded, eager, already halfway out the door. "And Janvier," Moreau added, "do not let him see the eagerness. Paris teaches that a man is safest when he thinks you have lost interest." The door closed and the inspector found himself alone, with the whispering shuffle of papers, the brass lamp, the faint smell of damp stone rising from the stairwell. He put the telegram in his pocket, folded precisely once, like a promise to be kept. Dawn found the Gare Saint-Lazare beaded with cold light, the platform slick as a fish's back. Porters moved along the carriages with practiced resignation, hoisting trunks, wiping rain from brass handles. Moreau boarded the second-class compartment, settled into the corner seat, and watched Paris dissolve through the window, first into roofs and chimneys, then into the wet fields where scarecrows lifted their arms like tired sentries. Opposite him sat a priest who slept with his mouth open, and beside the priest, an old woman in black who counted her rosary beads without moving her lips. Between stations, the inspector let the rhythm of the wheels loosen the knot of questions inside him. Lemaire, an accountant? Not a romantic crime then, but something that stank of calculation.
The small bruise at the temple, the dry pipe of a man who lied about where he spent the night, the lantern that swung when no honest lantern should have been there. Who chose the bridge? Who chose the river? Who chose the silence afterward? At Mantes, the priest rose with a guilty start and mumbled an apology to no one in particular. The train slid on past ditches that overflowed into trembling mirrors, past low farms where smoke hugged the thatch. In the corridor, a girl laughed and the sound came thin as a silver chain through the door. Moreau pressed the telegram flat on his knee once more. He liked names and dates. They kept a man from chasing ghosts. Etienne Lemaire, 48, scar at the jaw. He closed his eyes and imagined the scar, a thin white line half hidden by the day's shave, the kind of detail a careful murderer might miss when erasing a life's identity. Rouen announced itself not with grandeur, but with a smell, coals, smoke and wet iron, the bleach of the paper factory, the sour flinch of the docks. Under a sky the colour of pewter, the station spit out passengers in a shuffling line, their umbrellas lifting and dipping like crows. Moreau moved through them, hat low, and found the telegraph office first. He showed his badge, kept his voice soft, and asked for the clerk who had sent the wire. A thin man with ink on his cuffs stepped forward, all formal smiles and wary eyes. Yes, he had sent it. The request came from the prefecture, where Lemaire's wife had gone the day after her husband failed to return. She had brought a photograph, a few letters, a voice that did not tremble until it tried not to. Had Lemaire been in trouble? The clerk did not know. He had learned long ago to know only that which his job required him to transmit. Outside, the rain returned in a soft veil, not enough to soak, but enough to stain. Moreau walked to the prefecture, where the director received him with the courteous boredom reserved for colleagues from Paris. "Accountants," the man said, tapping a pencil against his teeth. "They go missing, and everything unravels. Salaries, inventories, the small dignities that keep a place from smelling like panic." Pellerin and Renault had requested discretion. Factories disliked attention the way guilty men disliked mirrors. Lemaire had worked there 13 years, reliable, punctual, without friends that anyone could name. A man who left the office at the same time, took the same route, folded his umbrella twice before shaking it in the same precise way each night at the door. "And yet," the director said, "the ones you never notice are the ones who vanish without calling out." At Pellerin and Renault, the gatekeeper grumbled at the badge, then softened when he read the letter from Paris. The yard smelled of hot oil and wet rope. A steam whistle blew from somewhere deep inside the sheds, a single, drawn-out sigh. In the accounting office the light was poor, filtered through high windows that the rain had turned into stained glass. Two clerks looked up with the calm hostility of men accustomed to balancing columns until they forgot the faces of those who asked questions. Lemaire's desk sat near the wall, square and neat even in his absence. Moreau noted the knife set at an exact angle to the blotter, the wooden box of spare nibs, the small, chipped cup that held clips and string. In the bottom drawer, nothing. In the second drawer, a ledger marked "Freight Adjustments." In the top drawer, a key with a cloth tag that read "Locker D14." The foreman explained without being asked. Workers kept small lockers near the docks where consignments were tallied and sealed. He liked to double-check, the foreman said, though the words sounded like a memory rehearsed for visitors. He said numbers behaved better if you watched them being born. Locker D14 conceded little. A pair of well-worn gloves, a pocket comb, a half-empty bottle of cheap cologne that smelled faintly of peppermint and regret. But tucked into the lining of the locker door, in a slit made by a careful penknife blade, Moreau's thumb found a folded slip of paper. He eased it out and read, not quite a letter, not quite a bill, a list of consignment numbers with small ticks beside some and small crosses beside others. At the bottom, in a hand unlike the numbers above, a brief instruction. Deliver quietly, door by the river. No signature, only the notation Montrose. The word hung like a bell inside his head. Montrose in Paris was a café where the smoke wrote lies on the ceiling. The sheet carried a smear of oil, a print of someone's impatience. He slipped it into his wallet and shut the locker. "Did Lemaire owe money?" he asked the foreman. The man hesitated the way men do when money is mentioned. Small debts, he admitted. A daughter in a convent school, a brother with a weakness for cards. Nothing that would drown him. Moreau did not correct the metaphor. And did anyone dislike him? The foreman smiled at that. In factories, dislike was the air people breathed. But Lemaire was not the sort to collect enemies. He was the sort to be used by those who preferred their names unsaid. The house in which Madame Lemaire lived stood on a street that held its breath. Curtains moved as Moreau approached. The door opened to a woman whose hair had surrendered to grey earlier than it wished. She did not cry. She had passed that bend in the river and now kept her grief in a jar where worry could drink from it as needed. "I knew he was gone when the soup cooled," she said quietly, as if confessing something indecent. She showed Moreau the photograph. Etienne, with his hat tilted back, the faint white scar visible along the jaw if one knew to look for it. "He went to Paris on Tuesday," she said. He did not say why, he said only, "It will be quick." He took his old wool coat because the weather was turning. Her hands worked at a handkerchief until it no longer resembled cloth. "Did he ever mention Montrose?" Moreau asked. Her eyes lifted, uncertain. "Only in passing. A cafe once, on a visit years ago, near the river." He did not drink much. He liked the idea of cafes more than the reality of them. The inspector paused at the bedroom door, where a neatness persevered that spoke less of housekeeping than of habits that had not yet learned they were redundant. On the dressing table, a small tin lay askew. Inside, a sheaf of railway stubs bound with thread, Rouen Paris, Paris Rouen. The dates were regular, the pattern weekly until 3 months ago when the frequency increased, sometimes twice in a week, and then again 4 days apart. He placed them back as he had found them. When he turned, Madame le Maire watched him with something like hope, and he could not tell whether the hope was for truth or for the careful lie that made sleep possible. "I will send word," he said, and closed the door softly behind him. Twilight laid itself across Rouen like a bruise. Near the river, boys ran along the quay, kicking a leather ball whose seams had burst, and in the distance bells counted the hour as if they were embarrassed to be heard. Moreau walked back toward the station, stopping at the corner shop for a newspaper and at the cafe for a cup he did not drink. His mind returned to the list from the locker, to the ticks and crosses, to the last line that married a direction to a place. Quietly, door by the river. He thought of Durand's hands, clean only where the oil had not reached, of a pipe too dry for the night it claimed to have witnessed, of the woman in the window whose memory trembled like the lilac stems she hung to dry. The web tightened. He knew the feel of a web when it began to discover its own center. On the platform, the night train exhaled steam like a tired horse. Moreau took the corner seat again, but this time the compartment held only a married couple who bickered in whispers and a soldier with a bandaged hand who slept like a child. He laid the newspaper on his lap and did not open it. Paris waited at the end of the line the way a question waits at the end of a bad answer. He thought of the Café Montrose and of a man who went by Durand, of Janvier watching a door that might never open, and of Lucas at the quay, sorting what could be sorted. The carriage rocked, a hypnotist's pendulum of steel and fog. Outside, the fields turned to nothing, and then to the faint outline of villages where windows wore their little crowns of light. Saint-Lazare received him with its usual blend of carelessness and precision. He took a cab as far as the river and then walked the rest, letting the stones speak whatever language stones speak. The Café Montrose was half full, a theatre between acts. The barman raised his eyebrows but said nothing. Moreau set the province of Rouen on the counter in the form of a damp umbrella and a look that neither invited nor refused conversation. He asked for a small cognac and let it sit. When the door opened, he did not turn. He did not have to. The limp was a quiet drum that crossed the floor, the pipe an old instrument lifted to a mouth that had learned to sing lies like lullabies. Durand stopped, as if a thread had pulled him taut. "Inspector," he said, smiling carefully, "the river didn't tell me you had taken a holiday." "Only a small one," Moreau replied. "Rouen is restful this time of year. They keep their books tidy." Durand's gaze flicked to the window, then back. A man at the far table coughed twice, a signal to no one, a habit to everyone. The barman dried a glass that did not need drying. All of Paris crowded into the small room and placed its finger to its lips. "Will you sit?" Moreau asked, and Durand did, his limp folding into the chair like a dog that knew its master's voice. "I hear you sleep well," the inspector said softly. "A rare gift in men who work by the river." Durand's smile did not reach his eyes. "The river doesn't trouble honest men, Inspector." Moreau leaned closer. "It troubles all men, but it troubles dishonest numbers more." He put his wallet on the table, opened it, and slid out the folded slip from locker D14. Durand glanced down, then up. For the first time, the lie in his face lost its footing. "You've taken an interest in factory business," he said. "Factories are dull." Moreau nodded. "They are. But dullness is where clever men hide their crimes. Quietly, door by the river. You know the door." Durand's pipe wavered. Beyond the glass, the fog pressed its forehead to the pane like a child peering into a shop window. "If you intend to make an arrest," Durand said, "do it. I'm more tired of your voice than you understand." Moreau smiled, not unkindly. "Not yet. I prefer to understand the shape of a thing before I break it. Tell me only this. When Etienne Le Maire came to Paris on Tuesday, did he meet you by the river, or did someone else keep the appointment for you?" The name landed between them like a metalled spoon on china. Durand's eyes shifted toward the back room, where a door led to a yard that backed onto the lane that led to the water. "The river keeps no appointments," he murmured, and stood. "And it forgets most names." He left without haste, his limp beating the same remembered rhythm along the floor and into the fog beyond. Moreau let him go. There is a time to follow a man, and a time to learn where he is going by not following him. He raised the cognac to his lips at last, swallowed the small heat it offered, and placed the glass carefully on the saucer as if it were a piece on a board that he intended to move later. Outside, the lamps along the quay marked the edge of the world in yellow beads. The Pont de Charenton waited with its stone patience, as it had, the night Le Maire crossed the city into silence. When Moreau finally stepped back into the street, the fog gathered him with the indifference of weather that had long ago made its peace with tragedy. He turned his collar up and walked toward the bridge, not because he expected to find anything, but because men return to the places that have begun to arrange the furniture inside their minds. In the river's slow speech, he heard the promise that had been in the telegram: a name, a desk, a list, a door by the water. Somewhere between Rouen and this cafe, between an office of lined paper and a locker that smelled faintly of peppermint, a line had been crossed that dared him to notice. He noticed, and tomorrow, or the tomorrow after that, he would put his hand on the exact hinge of it and feel the city shift. The Café Montrose never looked the same twice. By morning it was a haven for dockworkers and traders, full of boots and shouts and the hiss of steaming pots. By night it became something else, half theatre, half confession box, its patrons wrapped in smoke and secrecy. Inspector Moreau had always thought of it as the city's pulse disguised as a café, a place where men spoke without listening and women listened without speaking. That evening, as the fog pressed close to the windows like an audience demanding entry, Moreau returned. He sat at his usual table, the one that offered both shadow and view. The same barman was behind the counter, wiping the same spotless glass, but the room had changed in small ways only the observant would notice. The card players had shifted nearer the stove, the women in the corner spoke with less laughter than before, and the piano in the back stood silent, as if aware of a secret it couldn't play. Durand had not appeared yet, but his absence felt present. It hung in the air like unburned tobacco. Moreau ordered a coffee he didn't intend to drink and lit his pipe, its smoke drifting upward in soft curls. Every time he returned to this place, he felt Paris breathe differently, as though the city itself held its breath while waiting to see what he would uncover next. Lucas arrived a few minutes later, shaking the rain from his hat. "Janvier's still watching the depot," he said quietly. "No sign of Durand since last night." "He's in hiding," Moreau replied, eyes fixed on the mirror behind the bar. "But not the kind of hiding that lasts. Men like Durand can't bear silence for long. It reminds them of conscience." Lucas followed his gaze to the reflection of the room. "You think he's still in Paris?" "He's too proud to run. When men like him flee, they do it with a ticket and a plan. He's waiting for something. Or someone." The door opened then, as if summoned by the thought. Two men entered, bringing the cold with them. Their coats were heavy, their faces drawn tight with the fatigue of long days spent pretending to belong. One of them, thin, sharp-featured, with a moustache cut to precision, looked around with the wary calm of a man. Accustomed to noticing exits before tables, Moreau recognized the type. Not criminals, functionaries, men who served invisible masters. The pair took a table near the back, ordered brandy, and began talking in low voices. Lucas leaned forward. "They're not locals?" "No," Moreau murmured. "But Paris always welcomes those who come bearing secrets." A waiter passed, leaving a folded newspaper on Moreau's table. The inspector glanced at it casually, though his attention was already drifting elsewhere. In the mirror he saw one of the newcomers watching him. Just a flicker, nothing more. But it was enough. He unfolded the newspaper. The headline read, "Industrial Accountant Missing from Rouen. Scandal Suspected at Machine Works." Beneath the article, a grainy photograph of Etienne Lemaire stared out, younger than the corpse had been, but unmistakable. So, the river's story had found the press. And if the press knew, others would know too, those who needed silence most. He turned a page, pretending to read, while the two men in the corner continued their muted exchange. Now and then one of them gestured subtly toward the door. Moreau caught Lucas's eye and nodded. "Go outside, watch who follows when they leave, and keep your distance." Lucas rose, careful not to scrape the chair, and slipped out through the side door. The inspector remained motionless, except for the slow curl of pipe smoke. The cafe's rhythm resumed around him, spoons against porcelain, a laugh cut short, the whistle of the wind finding its way through an unseen crack in the window. When the two men finally stood, they left payment on the table and walked out without looking back. Moreau waited a full minute before rising. As he adjusted his coat, the barman cleared his throat. "Busy night for a man who doesn't drink," he said lightly. "Observation is its own intoxication," Moreau replied. "Tell me, have you ever seen those two before?" The barman's towel stilled for a moment, then resumed. "They come once a week, always together, never the same day twice. One of them has an accent, lion maybe. They don't stay long enough to remember." "Do they ever meet anyone?" The barman hesitated, then nodded toward the rear room. "Durand, twice, but not recently. They sit where you sat, talk little, pay well." Moreau placed a coin on the counter. "If they return, tell them the inspector who doesn't drink was asking after their health." He stepped outside. The night air bit at his face. Across the street, Lucas stood under a gas lamp, notebook in hand. "They headed toward the quay," he said. "A black carriage was waiting. No markings. They didn't speak to the driver." "Did you see where it went?" "Toward the east docks, past the warehouses." Moreau nodded. "Then that's where we'll go." They followed on foot, keeping to the edges of the fog. The cobbles were slick, reflecting the lamplight in broken patterns. At the docks the world shrank to the smell of salt and diesel, to the creak of mooring ropes and the slow murmur of the river. Ahead, the carriage stopped near a storage building marked with a fading stencil. R&Co. The same initials, the same ghost. The driver stepped down, opened the door, and the two passengers disappeared inside. A moment later, the lights in the upper window flared to life, thin lines of gold cutting through the mist. Moreau and Lucas took cover behind a stack of crates, Through the warped glass, shadows moved, one tall, one slight, and a third figure joining them. Even from this distance, Moreau felt the recognition tighten in his chest. Durand? His limp was unmistakable. The three men spoke for several minutes. Then one of the officials set a small black case on the table. Durand leaned over it, his head low. The light caught the side of his face, and Moreau saw something there, a fear too deep for guilt, too specific for greed. "Money," Lucas whispered. "No," Moreau said. "Paper, documents, maybe the same kind Lemaire handled before he died." A sudden movement interrupted the scene, Durand recoiling, shouting something they couldn't hear. One of the men reached for him, another raised a hand, and in the next moment, the lamp was struck down. Darkness swallowed the window. Moreau moved first. He dashed to the side door, pistol drawn, Lucas close behind. But when they entered, the air inside was already thick with smoke and the smell of kerosene. A fire had started in the waste bin, licking up the wall in frantic orange tongues. The table stood overturned, the case open and empty. Of the three men, only one remained, Durand, crumpled near the stairs, his breath shallow, a red line running from temple to ear. Moreau knelt beside him, feeling for a pulse. "Alive," he murmured. Durand's eyes fluttered open. He saw the inspector and tried to speak. The words came in fragments. "Didn't mean to," they said. "The bridge again." "What bridge?" Moreau demanded. "Charenton?" Durand nodded faintly, then stiffened. "Not me. The message. Lemaire. He thought he could stop them." His head rolled to the side. The breath left him like a sigh escaping stone. The flames climbed higher, crackling along the beams. Lucas shouted for water, but Moreau was already searching the floor. Near the corner, half-burnt paper scattered from the open case. He snatched one before the fire claimed it. A torn invoice, stamped with the same initials, R&Co. Beneath the mark, faint ink bled through. Consignment, 47, for ministry use only. By the time the fire brigade arrived, the upper floor was collapsing. The other two men were gone, vanished into the fog, leaving only the echo of boots and the stench of smoke. Moreau stood outside, coat blackened at the sleeves, watching the flames curl and fade. Lucas came beside him, face pale. "He's dead?" "Yes," Moreau said quietly. "And he died trying to tell the truth too late?" "What truth?" "The kind men drown for," Moreau murmured. "The kind that hides beneath the bridge, waiting to be pulled out one body at a time." He looked toward the river, where the reflection of the fire trembled on the surface like a wound that refused to close. Somewhere out there, another current was moving, quiet, controlled, pulling everything toward one inevitable end. Tomorrow he would find what waited beneath that reflection. The smoke from the warehouse fire lingered over the quay long after the last hose had fallen silent, a grey shawl the river would not shrug off. Inspector Moreau walked away only when the charred beams began to sigh into themselves, as though the building had decided to remember nothing. Lucas kept pace, half a step behind, his boots soft against the wet stones, his breath still quick from the heat and the running and the brief, useless attempts at rescue. The night had settled into that peculiar hour when Paris feels emptied of witnesses, when every street seems to have practiced forgetting. Moreau's thoughts did not forget. They circled the same points with the stubborn patience that made his colleagues call him implacable when they meant difficult. Durand at the window with two men who were not dock workers and not policemen, the small black case, the blaze started too quickly to be an accident. The invoice stamped R&Co, consignment 47, for ministry use only. He held the half-burnt paper between two fingers like a talisman that knew the name of its owner but refused to speak. By the time they reached the Quai des Orfèvres, the lamps had shaded themselves to a kind of weariness. Inside, the corridors smelled of damp wool and old tobacco. Lucas peeled off toward the records room to begin the tedious miracle of making sense of numbers that had been designed to be sensed only by the men who wrote them. Moreau stood at his desk, set the charred scrap down, and traced with a thumbnail the blurred stamp where the ink had run. R encoded. Not a tailor's mark then, not a coincidence hung on a lapel by a provincial artisan, but a house that reached from Rouen docks to a Paris warehouse and straight into the pockets of whoever signed papers in rooms where windows did not open. He closed his eyes and saw again the lantern under the bridge, the rope-rubbed scratches on the stone, the limp rhythm crossing the cafe's boards. Each image was a piece. Together they suggested the outline of a shape he could not yet name. He needed a clearer shape. He needed the drawer. Etienne Lemaire had taken a room in Paris. The ticket stubs made that certain. Men who came and went with such frequency, discreet and punctual as he had been, chose boarding houses that did not advertise themselves. Lucas returned with an address before dawn because Lucas had the gift of asking questions as if he were afraid of the answers, and thus always received more than he sought. Rue des Trois Rescapés, 3rd floor, a key left with the concierge who spoke little and watched much. The city was still rinsing its streets when they arrived, shopkeepers throwing pale water into the gutters, a milk cart clattering like loose teeth. The concierge led them up with the defeated dignity of men accustomed to tragedies in other people's rooms. He paid weekly, she said, not without respect. Never brought women, never brought noise. The door opened on a neat bed, a narrow wardrobe, a washstand that still held a ring of scum around the basin where a careful man had shaved. On the table lay a folded newspaper from 2 days ago, turned face down as if the room itself were shy. Moreau did not step forward at once. He stood in the doorway and let the room speak in its small vocabulary. The scuff on the floor where a chair had been moved an unnecessary inch. The black thread caught in a splinter of the desk, not from a coat sleeve, but from a spool, cut with a knife too sharp for domestic sewing. The faint smell of peppermint that had followed him from locker D14, now softened by a sweeter, older scent, the trace of sealing wax. He moved to the desk and ran 2 fingers along its edge until he found the burr that told him where the drawer would stick. The top drawer came easy, the usual trifles in their appointed places. Envelopes, a pencil, shaved to a miserly point, a single matchbook from a cafe not the Montrose, placed there, not as a memory, but as a possible excuse should anyone ask whether he liked to go out at night. The second drawer held a Bible more consulted than read, and a soapstone charm so unremarkable it might, in another life, have seemed precious. The bottom drawer resisted. He teased it open, felt the scrape of a nail driven at an angle to keep out impatient hands, and saw at once what he had come for. It was not a letter in the ordinary sense, not a confession that would allow a widow to grieve along a straight line. It was a packet, folded twice in brown paper, bound with a length of string that had been knotted and unknotted more than once. He loosened it and found inside 3 things: a set of copies, meticulous, neat, of consignment tallies for R&Co, a thinner sheet with 4 names written without titles, as if to deny them the protection titles grant, and at the bottom a letter in a different hand, softer, almost apologetic in its slant, resting like a hand on the other papers. He read the letter first because he knew men like Lemaire organized their courage beneath the thing they most feared. Monsieur Lemaire, it began, though the address held none of the small courtesies that distance a man from another man's peril. You will forgive the indirection. We write as men who cannot be seen to write. The consignments you adjust are not unknown to us. The differences you note, those ticks and crosses you keep like small prayers, are not accidents of the dock. They are the plan. We do not ask you to participate. We ask you not to obstruct. The bridge is for water, not for conscience. There will be compensation for your prudence, enough to ease a household where the arithmetic has become cruel. Do not speak to the police. Do not speak to the press. The signature was not a signature, but a mark, a tiny emblem of a crossed key. Beneath, a final line, Montrose is only a word. The door by the river opens and closes without it. Moreau set the letter down and listened, not to the room which had said its piece, but to the corridor outside where someone had paused to hear whether he would call out to the concierge to ring the police bell for witnesses. He did not. He looked next at the tallies. The copies bore dates that aligned with the rhythm of rail journeys in the tin where the widow kept her stubs, and the figures turned like fish in a net when you read them according to the margin marks. Consignment 47 appeared twice in different weeks, once with a note, returned, damp barrels, again with delivered to ministry. Several numbers bore small crosses that matched those from the slit of locker D14. The difference between a tick and a cross, he realized, was not approval and error, it was removal and insertion. Something was being taken out of ordinary circulation and reintroduced under cover of official necessity. Between the docks of Rouen and the River d'Or in Paris, a portion of the city's invisible traffic had been captured and renamed until it belonged to those who spoke in rooms without windows. The paper with the 4 names held his eyes longer than he expected. They were not the names he anticipated. No ministers here, no familiar functionaries whose signatures appeared in newspapers like stage directions. An agent of the river police with a reputation for making contraband evaporate as if it had simply dissolved back into water. A clerk from the prefecture whose competence had never included a raised voice. A warehouse foreman whose wages did not reach as far as his new boots, and who had no limp but favored his right side as if memory itself had weighted it. And one more, a deputy from a ministry whose portfolio shifted with the winds and who never went to cafes, leaving his drinks to be paid for in rooms where drinks were not served. The names were bait and map both. Le Maire had written them because he understood the mathematics of guilt. You balance columns by knowing what each figure pretends to be. "What is it?" Lucas asked, standing at his shoulder with the reverence of a young priest before a reliquary. "Proof," Moreau said, "but not the kind that wins a case, the kind that clarifies the crime." He slipped the packet back into the drawer, then removed it again. "No," he corrected softly, more to himself than to Lucas. "The drawer does not get to close. This city has too many drawers that have learned to close." He wrapped the packet in his own handkerchief and slid it into the inside pocket of his coat. The room had only one other place where a careful man might put words he could not risk to paper, above the lintel. Moreau reached and found the ridge, the roughness where plaster had been lifted and replaced with the patience of a bird building a nest from twigs that belonged elsewhere. He pried loose the small plug and eased out an envelope so thin it had nearly become air. Inside lay a single train receipt, Rouen to Paris Tuesday, folded around a visiting card the size of a lie told well. The card bore a name he knew too well to be surprised by. Henri Valdemar, Deputy Under-Secretary, Ministry of Supply. The back of the card carried a time and a place. Tuesday, 8 in the evening, door by the river. "Valdemar," Lucas breathed, as if the name had stepped into the room and asked for a chair. "Will you arrest him?" "On what?" Moreau asked. "On a card he did not sign and a letter that signed itself with a key anyone might own. We will see him. We will listen. We will say nothing that tells him how much we have learned, and we will watch what his silence chooses to confirm." They sealed the room as gently as a doctor who knows that healing has nothing to do with the body before him. Downstairs, the concierge accepted their thanks with a nod that kept her from seeing the weight in Moreau's pocket. Outside, the day had shaken itself awake. Rain withdrew into the cracks, leaving the pavements a dull mirror. The river ran on, not in flood now, but with the steady patience of a city that understood both necessity and habit. Back at the quay, Janvier awaited them with the kind of expression that meant he had news that did not fit easily in the mouth. "A message came," he said, handing over a folded note without envelope. The writing was the undecided hand of a man who had learned letters under poor light. "Inspector, if you want to know what the bridge is for, come to the yard behind the Montrose after midnight. Come alone. The river has a memory tonight. no signature, only the same crossed key drawn clumsily in the corner. Moreau read it twice. He laid it beside the half-burned invoice and the card that had been hidden above a lintel like a blessed relic inverted to keep demons at bay. Lucas said nothing. He had learned from Moreau that sometimes questions frighten answers back into their holes. The inspector stood at the window and watched a barge push toward the next lock, its pilot hunched in a posture that suggested not fatigue, but caution. In the glass he saw his own face, a map of streets and fog and documents that pretended to be innocent until you asked them to describe themselves. 2 crimes, he said at last, almost with relief at having found the words. 1 the old sort. Numbers moved from one pocket to another while clerks look away. The other is newer only in its pretense, an accident prepared for a man who refused to be bought. They dressed murder as a necessity and called it order, and someone has decided we may be allowed to know just enough to keep the rest from burning. Valdemar? Lucas asked. Or someone who writes his name on cards for him, Moreau said. Tonight we will see which. He closed the office lamp with a coin of a gesture, as if to preserve its small pool of light for his return. The afternoon collapsed into an evening that seemed predetermined, like a page in a ledger that had already been ruled for a sum you had not yet calculated. He walked again to the bridge because a man returns to beginnings when he senses an ending approaching. The stone bore the same scratches, but now they explained themselves. A rope, a weight, a body eased over with the care of a clerk, setting a figure into its column so precisely that anyone looking quickly would see only alignment. When he turned back toward the city, the first lamps had ignited, and in their faint halos the rain looked like fine ash. He thought of Madame le Maire counting the minutes, the way his widow's hands had tied the stubs with thread, of Durand's last sentence broken over the syllables of a bridge, of the barman's non-answers that had begun to sound like a dialect. Only men with something to lose learned to speak. He touched the pocket where the drawer's letter lay, and it was like touching a rib that had been cracked, reminding him of the breath that had gone wrong. Midnight would come soon enough. He would go to the yard behind the Montrose alone, as invited. But he would not go unaccompanied. He would take with him the river, the drawer, the names written without titles, and the knowledge that when men ask a policeman to come alone, what they really ask is whether he has understood who owns the night. Paris lay half asleep beneath a low ceiling of cloud, the kind that presses the lamps closer to the streets and turns every puddle into a secret. Inspector Moreau walked alone toward the river, the sound of his steps softened by mist. Midnight approached. The city's louder voices had retreated behind shutters, only the quiet ones remained, shadows that smoked, waited, and bargained. The yard behind the Café Montrose looked different without its noise. Barrels stood like sentinels, and the single lamp above the rear door flickered with the nervousness of someone aware he was being watched. Moreau stopped short of the light, letting his eyes adjust. There was no sound but the river, no figure but his own. He waited. The invitation had said nothing about how long patience might be tested, and patience was the only weapon he trusted more than a revolver. When the door finally opened, it did so without haste. A man in a dark overcoat stepped out, gloved, composed, and unmistakably unafraid. His features emerged by degrees, a narrow face, the faint gleam of spectacles, a mouth that preferred restraint to expression. Henri Valdemar, Deputy Under-Secretary, Ministry of Supply. The visiting card above the lintel had not lied. "You came," Valdemar said, his tone casual, almost courteous. "I had my doubts. Few men keep appointments that promise nothing." "I dislike unanswered invitations," Moreau replied. "They breed impoliteness." Valdemar smiled thinly. "You found something in Rouen." "I found a man who refused to be bought." "That," the minister said, "is often the same thing." He gestured toward the door. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and ink. The office had once served as the cafe's storeroom, but now a single desk and 2 chairs gave it the intimacy of confession. Valdemar closed the door, turned down the lamp until the light became a circle no wider than a ledger. "You understand discretion," he began, "so let us speak plainly. The papers you recovered from Lemaire's room belong to the state." "The state owns many papers," Moreau said. "Some of them stain easily." A pause, then a quiet laugh. "You have courage, or perhaps fatigue. They look the same after 20 years. He drew a cigarette, struck a match, and for an instant the flare lit his face with a clarity almost moral. "Lemaire was an honest man," he said, "but honesty can become treason when it appears at the wrong table. He saw figures meant only for oversight committees, allocations, transfers, adjustments that keep the machine moving. He believed corruption where there was merely necessity." "Necessity," Moreau echoed, "the word men use when law grows inconvenient." Valdemar exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. "You think like a poet. Unfortunately, nations are not poems. They are budgets and warehouses and men like me who ensure that the army marches even when the books protest. Lemaire threatened that order." "So he was silenced?" "Corrected," Valdemar said. "The correction was clumsy. I did not approve of the bridge." The simplicity of the confession chilled more than any denial. Moreau studied him, the even breathing, the fingers steady on the cigarette. "You called me here to tell me this?" "To offer understanding," Valdemar said. "You are a practical man. You have served long enough to know what happens when scandals reach daylight. Ministers fall, departments crumble, the innocent starve while the virtuous congratulate themselves. The country cannot afford purity. And what do you offer in its place?" "Continuity." He leaned forward. "I will close the investigation quietly. The death will remain accidental. In return, you will be promoted to Chief Inspector before winter. Your record will stay immaculate. You will keep your conscience, provided you teach it, silence." Moreau felt the weight of the city in that small room, the quiet buildings, the wet stone, the bureaucrats who built their altars from paper. He thought of Madame Lemaire waiting by her window, of Durand gasping through smoke, of the rope marks on the bridge's stone. "You mistake me," he said softly. "I don't want your promotion." Valdemar's smile did not falter. "Then want your peace. You will find neither truth nor gratitude if you continue. And he tapped the ash into a saucer, "I will not be able to protect you from those who prefer that accidents remain accidents." Outside, a gust of wind rattled the shutters. Somewhere on the quay, a barge horn sounded once, low and mournful. Moreau rose. "Protection is for men who believe in rescue. I believe only in consequence." He turned toward the door, but Valdemar's voice halted him. "Inspector, one last courtesy. You think yourself incorruptible, but corruption is not always gold in a pocket. Sometimes it's a letter you choose not to write. Consider before you send yours." Moreau left without answering. The fog swallowed him as though the room had never existed. He walked along the river until the ministry buildings came into view, tall silhouettes reflected in trembling water. He wondered how many secrets each window held, how many doors by the river opened and closed without witnesses. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Lucas was waiting, his face pale beneath the gaslight. "You were gone too long," he said. "I was ready to raise the alarm." "You would have woken the wrong men," Moreau murmured. He handed Lucas the packet from the drawer. "Lock this in the archives under the R code. No indexing, no copies." Lucas hesitated. "That will bury it." "For now," Moreau said. "Sometimes a file must sleep before it wakes in the right hands." He looked out across the Seine, where dawn was beginning to unbutton the night. The river moved with its usual patience, indifferent to bargains struck in back rooms. He wondered if Valdemar was watching from some office window, certain the inspector had been persuaded. Perhaps that certainty was useful. "Sir," Lucas said quietly, "will you let it go?" Moreau lit his pipe, the flame trembling, before surrendering to smoke. "I will let it go as far as it allows me to follow." For 3 days, Paris pretended nothing had happened. The papers printed smaller scandals. The ministry released figures that did not mention Rouen or Consignment 47. The café reopened, its walls scrubbed of smoke. Yet beneath the surface, the current shifted. An anonymous envelope arrived on Moreau's desk containing a single phrase typed in stiff capitals. "He has not finished building the bridge." That night, the inspector dreamt of water-climbing stone steps, of files fluttering open in the wind, of Valdemar's voice whispering from somewhere behind the fog. When he woke, the city was already stirring, the smell of bread and soot seeping through the shutters. He sat up slowly, listening to the heartbeat of the street, and thought, "Every system believes itself eternal until one man remembers." He dressed, buttoning his coat as if armoring himself against the day. Lucas met him at the door, eyes questioning. "Where
Now?" "To the ministry," Moreau said. "If the bridge is still being built, I'd like to see what passes for its foundation." As they crossed the Pont Neuf, the sun tore briefly through the clouds, gilding the water in a deceitful brightness. Beneath that light, Paris looked innocent, almost young, as though it had never hidden a body at all. Moreau paused at the midpoint of the span, watching the current twist around the piers, and murmured, "You remember everything, don't you?" The river gave no answer, but its ripples caught the gold and carried it downstream, as if promising to deliver it elsewhere, someday. By the time Inspector Moreau arrived at the Ministry of Supply, the city had fully awakened, its steam and footsteps rising upward like a chorus, both indifferent and relentless. The building loomed near the Rue de Lille, an edifice of limestone and brass that seemed to pride itself on how little it required the sun to appear authoritative. Inside, the air smelled of ink, oil, and ambition. Secretaries glided across polished floors with the efficiency of birds that had forgotten how to land. Clerks hunched over ledgers whose margins stayed blank, not for lack of thought, but for surplus of fear. Moreau and Lucas were ushered into a waiting room where time had been trained to pass slowly. The man who finally emerged bore the weight of someone not accustomed to being kept waiting himself. His suit was precisely pressed, his hair parted with an architect's precision. But it was the eyes that told the truth, steady, hollow, a color that suggested 1,000 signatures signed without regret. "Inspector Moreau," he said, extending a hand that felt like an object more than a gesture. "I am Marcel Fournier, Chief Counsel to the Deputy Under-Secretary." "Not Valdemar," Moreau noted aloud. "His schedule is full," Fournier replied, as if reciting something that had been written for him. "But you may speak to me with the same confidence." "Confidence?" Moreau echoed, letting the word dissolve without assent. Lucas stood still as a shadow beside him, notebook unopened, but mind already recording every intonation. Fournier sat behind his desk, gesturing toward 2 chairs that faced him like defendants rather than guests. "I understand you wish to discuss the Rouen case. Purely administrative, I assure you." "Nothing near a river is purely administrative," Moreau responded. "Your ministry's name appeared in a document found near a dead accountant." The counsel folded his hands, the movement elegant as origami. Le Maire was a clerk, a capable one, but a clerk nonetheless. His death is tragic, yet men die every day without elevating their paperwork to scandal. "Unless," Moreau said, "they discover that paperwork is being used for something other than supply." Fournier's jaw worked once, then stilled. "You are welcome to lodge such concerns with the Inspector General. Until then, the
ministry will consider this matter concluded." "And yet," Moreau said, leaning slightly forward, "the river continues to produce bodies." Silence stretched across the desk, then fractured as the door opened behind them. A woman entered, young, shaken, clutching a handkerchief in both hands. Her eyes flicked between the inspector and the counsel, then found a point somewhere on the carpet where truth felt safest. Moreau recognized the posture immediately. Someone in the building had chosen to confess. "I'm sorry," she said, breath catching like a paper caught in a drawer. "I can't bear it anymore. I delivered the files. I knew it wasn't legal, but they said it was for the war budgets, that it would help keep the trains running. And then, when the man went missing, they told me not to speak." Fournier stood so sharply that his chair rocked back. "Mademoiselle Perrault, that will be all." But she didn't move. "You have to understand," she rushed on. "The documents, they weren't just tallies, they were exemptions, signatures, roads, and rails being diverted to off-book projects, not for the army, for men I never saw except in the lower cells." One of them called himself Durand. Lucas flinched. The name hit the air like a return of breath that had been forcibly stopped. Moreau watched the woman's hands tremble as she dug into her purse. From it, she produced a folded sheet, creased and smudged, but unmistakably official. "This," she said, laying it before them, "is the final diversion order for consignment 47. It's signed with Valdemar's cipher." Fournier's voice, when it came, was low and lethal. "Perrault, you will leave at once. Your access is revoked. If you remain, you risk charges that will follow you into poverty." She turned to go, yet her gaze found Moreau's one last time, full of the ruin that comes when a conscience refuses to forget. "I tried to burn it," she whispered, "but I think something wants it remembered." When the door closed, Fournier exhaled a long, contained breath. "Inspector," he said slowly, "if you proceed on the basis of a frightened girl's guilt, you will find yourself outside your jurisdiction." Moreau rose. "I am not proceeding on her guilt. I am proceeding on yours." They left before replies could be summoned and dressed as threats. Outside, the wind carried a siren's cry from somewhere unseen. Lucas fell into step beside the inspector, face pale with equal parts indignation and awe. "She told the truth," he said. "You saw it." "Yes," Moreau replied, "but the truth without proof is only rumor. The document she held, that was proof. Now we must keep it." As they reached the Seine, heavy grey clouds lowered themselves like uninvited thoughts. They walked in mindful silence, the weight of what they now held heavier than any pistol or file. The ministry had exposed a seam. Soon it would sew it shut again. That evening they returned to the Quai des Orfèvres. The letter from Le Maire, the invoice from the fire, and Perrault's document were laid out on Moreau's desk, like evidence at a silent trial. "What now?" Lucas asked. "We wait," Moreau said. "When a system cracks, it always shakes the people who profit from its stillness. Someone will make a mistake. And when they do..." A sharp knock at the door interrupted him. Janvier entered, breathless. "They've come, sir. 3 men from the ministry. They have a removal order for the Le Maire file, signed by the prosecutor's office." Moreau exchanged a glance with Lucas. "And the archives?" Lucas asked. "Guarded," Janvier said. "They came with 2 gendarmes." Moreau stood, finished his cold coffee and rolled his sleeves. "Let them take the file," he said. "What matters isn't in the file." "What matters is in your pocket," Lucas murmured. "And in the river," Moreau added. "Always in the river." That night, with the skies split by distant thunder, a second anonymous note arrived, slipped under the door, unsigned. "If you want proof that reaches beyond paper, come to the Quai warehouse at dawn. I will show you the cargo." Moreau held it under the lamp and watched the shadows on the wall grow long. "The bridge still stands?" he said quietly. "And someone is tired of crossing it alone." He put on his coat. The night received him as it always had, wet, heavy, and utterly without surprise. But the inspector walked with urgency all the same, for dawn would not wait. Dawn had barely cut a line into the sky when Inspector Moreau stepped onto the quay. The warehouse loomed before him like a monolith of smoke-darkened timber and rusted hinges, a structure that seemed to know too well the difference between what was stored, what was counted, and what was buried. The river lapped at the stones with a sound like distant applause, indifferent and eternal. Lucas and Janvier waited at the edge of the yard, their faces set in the grim tension of men who understood that justice rarely arrives clothed in the clarity of morning. A soft creak broke the silence. The warehouse door, tall and uneven as a story half believed, swung inward. A shadow emerged, slight, cautious, but unmistakably alert. Mademoiselle Perrault stepped into the light, her face paler than the fog swirling at her ankles. "You came," she said, voice low. "I wasn't sure they hadn't followed you." "Then speak quickly," Moreau replied. "Show us what you risked everything to keep hidden." She led them inside. The air was cold, scented with wet rope and cargo tar. A row of crates stood stacked along the western wall, each marked with the now too familiar initials R & Co. But it was the crate at the far end that held their attention. Not for its size, but for the seal affixed to it, a wax imprint, a crossed key. The same mark from the letter in Lemaire's drawer. Perrault knelt and removed a pry bar from her coat. Her hands trembled only slightly as she forced the lid open. Inside, beneath a layer of straw, were rolled blueprints, ledgers, dozens of them, bundled in brown paper. She lifted one and unwrapped it. "The ministry doesn't just divert supplies," she said quietly. "They hide them. Rails, engines, fuel, all stripped from state accounts and delivered to private contractors, posing as military necessities. This isn't misappropriation, Inspector. It's theft, given the elegance of paperwork." Lucas picked up one of the ledgers. Numbers, lines, columns, all groomed into obedience. But beneath them, scratched lightly in pencil, were notes in Lemaire's hand, alternative tallies, differences, small, quiet interruptions in the illusion. He tried to balance the sums without erasing the truth, Moreau murmured. "And they killed him for his arithmetic." The air shifted then, not in temperature but in intention. A boot step echoed across the floor, followed by another, then another. The three turned toward the doorway, where a familiar voice spoke. "You should have burnt the letter when you had the chance, Inspector." Henri Valdemar entered, flanked by two uniformed men with unsmiling eyes. He wore the same coat, the same calm, the same thin mouth that preferred silence to lies. Only his gloves were new, untouched by ink, untouched by consequence. "I warned you," Valdemar said, stepping closer. "You think the river forgives your defiance, but even water has a ledger." Moreau stood firm, hands at his sides. "Did it occur to you," he asked softly, "that the bridge might not carry only your secrets?" Valdemar smiled. "It carries exactly what I choose, and it collapses when I choose." He gestured slightly, and one of the guards stepped forward, raising a revolver. Perrault moved before thought could stop her, a single cry tearing from her throat. "No!" She flung herself between Moreau and the barrel, her small frame suddenly towering in its resolve. The guard hesitated just long enough for the shot to go wide, splintering a crate. Lucas dove for the shadows. Janvier drew his pistol and stood shoulder to shoulder with the inspector. The next moments happened without language, a scuffle, a shout, a falling lamp, fire-licking old wood, the crack of bullets and broken glass. Valdemar backed toward the open doorway as though he had rehearsed this exit in his mind 100 times. But this time, no one followed his cues. Moreau lunged, catching Valdemar's coat. The two men struggled at the threshold, locked in a tableau of frantic breath and drenched wool. Valdemar's composure shattered, revealing the panic beneath. "You're alone, Inspector," he hissed. "No one will remember your version of this." "You mistake me," Moreau said, forcing him against the stone arch. "I don't need to be remembered. I need you not to be." The river answered, with its own logic. Valdemar twisted, slipped and fell backward into the slow grey water that had never loved him but had always been patient. No cry, no plea. Only the splash and the ripples that closed without ceremony. The gunfire stopped. The warehouse burned. Lucas and Janvier pulled Perrault to safety, her breaths sharp as night air, her palms streaked with blood and truth. From the yard they watched the flames devour the crates, the ledgers, the stamped papers. The river received light and shadow both, its surface flickering with the brief indecision of justice. When the fire brigade arrived, the morning had turned a resigned shade of silver. Smoke rose into the dawn like a story destined to be retold only by those who refused to forget. The ministry issued statements within the hour: tragic loss in a warehouse accident, dangerous criminal activity disrupted, noble civil servant missing and feared drowned. But somewhere in the Quai des Orfèvres archives, under a code no clerk would ever decipher, lay a packet from a dead man's drawer. A letter, a list, a card with a name now erased by water, and beneath it all, a promise not yet sealed. That evening, Moreau walked once more to the Pont de Charenton. The river glistened in the fading light, appearing almost innocent in its ceaseless motion. He leaned on the cold rail and lit his pipe, the flame briefly illuminating his eyes. "You remember everything, don't you?" he whispered. The Seine rolled on, a witness that neither accuses nor forgives. Behind him, Lucas approached. He carried no file, no badge, only a quiet question. "Will you write the report?" Moreau took a long pull of smoke, exhaled, and nodded. "Not yet," he said. "Let the river speak first." And in that quiet, between the notes of water and breath, another case began forming. Not in a drawer, not on a bridge, but in the unbroken space where memory refuses to drown.